Welcome back, guys. So first and foremost, your comments on all of these videos are much appreciated. Now all of these things that you do mention in the comments to all of these rewatch videos, I'm gonna make a from the comments video and upload it at the very end of rewatching the entire first season and uploading all its videos. My plan at the moment is to finish uploading all of these Season 1 rewatch videos before Season 6 airs. But after Season 6 airs, I'm going to start talking about Seasons 2, 3, 4, and 5. But for the time being, let's focus on the comments and let's talk about this video, because this video will include all the things that I've found on episodes 8 and 9. Now the big surprise over here is that episode 9 back in the day when we watched it for the very first time was kind of very dry. I was not on YouTube back then, but I went back and checked all the YouTubers who were active at the time, and surprisingly, most of these Easter eggs kind of flew over my head back in the day, and flew over everyone else's heads. But to get started with what will be one of the longer videos in this series, let's go for episode 8, which was otherwise titled The Well. Now this episode, episode 8 of the first season, aired around the time of the release of Thor the Dark World. In essence, and considering Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. always tied in with all of these Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, it was pretty understandable that we get quite the powerful tie-in with said movie. So, to get started, the narration by Jemma at the very beginning of that episode about the mythical gods from ancient times, the beliefs that faded away before we discovered they actually existed, mentioning Thor by the name. That's pretty much the obvious reference. Now while the obvious reference over here is to Thor, as in the character, and to Thor the Dark World, as in the movie releasing at the very same time that this episode aired, there is the subtle reference and the parallel to the narration by Odin on the very first Thor movie at the very beginning of the movie. But next to that is the shot of Asgard, as Jemma mentions it by name during her narration at the beginning of the episode. Fitz, once again, and as usual, references monkeys.
Still, this is definitely the type of work a monkey could easily do.
Now for one thing, still feels like a pop culture reference to 12 Monkeys, and also foreshadows the obsession that he keeps having all the way up until Season 5. But back to Thor the Dark World, going through the wreckage at Greenwich University at the very beginning of the episode, that was pretty much the reference to the Battle of Greenwich right out of the movie. But next up though is his guardians being identified as aliens. Now Coulson ties it there to Norse mythology because that's really their origin, but he also identifies that ancient belief in their godliness as a product of people in ancient times being unable to comprehend the concept of aliens.
Wouldn't mind getting my human hands on Thor. He's so dreamy.
Sure, he's handsome, but...
No, he's dreamy.
Now this is more of trivia, but in a recent interview, Ming-Na Wen stated her favorite MCU character next to Coulson is Thor. But next up though is the fact that the choice to start the core events of this episode in Trillemarka National Park in Norway, that sits very well with it being a Thor tie-in, Norse mythology and whatnot. But a reference to Thor and his hammer comes in the form of the Berserker staff piece that is picked by Petra at the very beginning of the episode, the readings on which ends up matching the readings on Thor's hammer. Now the Berserker staff did lead us to meeting up with Professor Elliot Randolph, and while the episode might have been unable to get a big cameo from the Thor movie, something that I vividly remember back then a lot of people whined about, even though we did have 4 cameos over the course of the first 7 episodes of the first season, Professor Elliot Randolph, aka the warrior who stayed. He was the next best thing and his guardian, making him the ultimate reference to Thor, the Dark World. But there are still a ton of Marvel Cinematic Universe references over here.
You should give your buddy, the God of Thunder, a shout. He gets his power from his hammer, right? What if this is his nail to the hammer?
I already did. Director Fury told me he's off the grid, and if he has a cell phone, we don't have the number.
But we've also got a reference to finding Thor's hammer, linking Elliot Randolph to that event, even though we never see him being part of it. So that's basically how Coulson kinda knows the guy. We used him back then as a consultant on Norse mythology, and we need to use him now. I think the show was trying to be a little bit sneaky over there, like hey, we're bringing about a crossover without actually having a crossover. Now I don't remember the exact words on the Thor movie, it's been a while now, but nonetheless I do remember that Coulson did order the bringing in of an expert to that little crater created by the hammer. So the entire story about Professor Randolph on this episode kind of fits perfectly with that kind of trope. But next up is our usual reference to, Coulson dying at the hands of Loki. I've spent some one-on-one time with aliens before, didn't work out too well. But there's also another reference to Loki, this time about his imprisonment on the Avengers at the hands of S.H.I.E.L.D. You're not the first Asgardian I had in custody. You guys don't flinch or panic in captivity. But there's also Daisy's statement with like 3 to 4 pop culture and historical references.
This is way, way better than the History Channel. I mean, this guy has lived through all the scary stuff. The Crusades, the Black Death, disco.
But anyway though, the interrogation room is made out of vibranium alloy, a reference to Captain America's shield made of the same alloy, and of course to the home of vibranium on Earth, Wakanda, which would become part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe a few years later. But finally though, on the Easter egg front on episode 8, Coulson recommending Portland to the professor was probably a reference to the cellist, you know, his girlfriend from Portland, the very girlfriend that he mentioned on the Avengers. But okay, time to talk foreshadowing on this episode.
Come on, you're telling me piloting an alien ship isn't on your bucket list?
Now the smile on May's face in response to Daisy's question does say it all, and apparently she got her wish on the premiere of Season 5. But on this episode as well, we do get flashbacks from Ward's childhood, which is all about the foreshadowing as to the history of Ward, you know, being bullied by his older brother into beating and torturing his youngest brother. In this one, the incident with the well is basically what the title of this episode is all about, and one of the many reasons that has Ward later on a future season, seek vengeance upon his brother. May talking about the incident in Bahrain, you know, seeing it every day, unlike Ward, who got all these memories of his childhood. That was once again foreshadowing us seeing on a future episode what happened with May on that mission in Bahrain. Finally though, in episode 8, we do get a glimpse into Tahiti and Coulson as he has a dream of his time there. And once again, it's all telling us that the story is not just about how long he's been dead, but also about the fact that Tahiti was just a hoax. With that being said though, we are finally at the more interesting part of this video from my personal point of view, and that would be Repairs, the 9th episode of the first season of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Alright, we've got a Roxxon gas station, and that's basically the shady company that we did see in quite the minor ways on all 3 Iron Man movies. But it's also prominently featured and in the form of a gas station on a funny thing happened on the way to Thor's hammer, the Marvel one-shot. Now the interesting part about that one is that Coulson was basically the lead of that one-shot, because he does stop by a Roxxon gas station, starting to buy donuts, and before the thing is over, he's basically stopped a robbery in progress. But Roxxon Energy Corporation in the Marvel Comics and in the Marvel Cinematic Universe is basically a filler for ExxonMobil. So when you see an ad for X1 Road Tested, you're basically thinking Mobil 1. Now the catalyst that kicked off the events of this 9th episode of the first season was basically a particle accelerator explosion, and this basically reminds us of a lot of things out of the comics. So for one thing, it felt like they're pulling out of these same stories, only setting it all up in numerous ways. For example, Graviton, aka Franklin Hall from episode 3, got his powers in the comics when an explosion causes molecules to fuse with the graviton particles generated by none other than a group of particle accelerators. But another thought that comes to mind over here is Peter Parker getting his powers in the 616 after having been bitten by a spider that caught radiation from a particle accelerator demonstration. But there's also another thought, I'd call it final, but there's one I'll make at the very end of this video. But this one happens to be about Hank Pym and the Pym Particle Accelerator. The Pym Particles are used in the Ant-Man suit to allow the shrinking in size for Ant-Man, and this applies both in the pages of the comics and the Ant-Man movies. But on a side note, and this is really more trivia than anything else, this was the very first time that we ever met Agent Daviiz on the series. Now we would later come to know the man by his name, and years later, some of us, myself included, are developing theories on how he survived the Wrath of Ada. Now as per the usual, and on so many episodes on the first season, and on so many episodes on seasons to follow, we get the reference to the comic book 616 continuity.
Mayday. Region North, this is Shield 616.
Circling back though to the particle accelerator, as suggested by the sign on the gate, it belongs to one Static Corp. But the newspaper clipping that Daisy checks later on happens to mention that it belongs to Accutech, and Accutech is part of both the comics and the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In the MCU and on the pages of the comics, the company was founded by Gilbert O'Connor to be acquired later on by Stark Industries. But alright, we've got Fitz and Jemma, the pranksters, a staple of the comics when it comes to team-ups. And I can think of two pranksters out of Marvel Comics, Loki being one, even though usually he's not part of a team-up, and usually he's doing it for an ulterior motive, and of course the fun. But there's also the Fantastic Four's Human Torch, who's really fond of pranking others. But here though comes another side note, a little bit of trivia, maybe not exactly trivia, but nonetheless, Fitz wearing that mask on this episode. He just looked very similar to how he looked on season 5, wearing the other mask, the Marauder mask, when he was on his mission to 2091 along with Enoch to rescue the team. But let us though leave pranking behind and circle back to the core storyline of this episode, because Hannah claiming she is being haunted by demons sort of makes me think of a lot of things. Now, I'm not saying this is foreshadowing, not saying that they clearly planned this from the very beginning, but we do know that we get to meet Ghost Rider later on in the events of the series. However, though, at some point on the pages of the comics, Man-Thing was actually possessed by a demon. But then again, why would I think Man-Thing? A reference made later on in the events of the same episode actually had me jump to Man-Thing being the possible reference over here. We'll get to that in a moment though. But still on Hannah being haunted by demons, there were no demons really, but rather Tobias Ford. He was the villain of the episode. Now because of this one similarity, he did remind me of the minor Iron Man villain out of the comics, Professor Ford. Professor Ford did create the technology used by Plan Chu to create what is known as the microscopic army. Now when you think about it, the entire idea of shrinking an army in a way that has you not see them coming, like literally, not due to strategy, not due to anything of that sort, but rather because they are hiding in plain sight, kind of matches the way Tobias Ford was portrayed over here. But still on Ford, him calling the window that Jemma states the explosion opened as a window to hell. That felt like a reference to the demonic dimension in the comics. It also takes us back to the talk about demons early on in the events of the episode, connects as well to the entire Man-Thing that I was talking about earlier, and also to Ghost Rider. But once again, we'll circle back to Ghost Rider in a moment here and get to talk about him a lot. Still on Tobias though, Jemma describing her first encounter with him as seeing a ghost who dematerialized, kind of phased away. It all felt like a reference to the Iron Man comic book villain back then, Ghost, who would in 2018 be portrayed by Hannah John Kamen on none other than Ant-Man and the Wasp. But next up is Daisy referring to the interrogation room as the Nightmare Box. Now I could think of a couple of references over here, but the one that sounds most suitable for this situation happens to be the items with the same name on the pages of Marvel Comics. Now without going into detail, considering the time on this video, the Nightmare Box kind of appeared for the very first time on the pages of the comics, on the pages of Man-Thing, before appearing later on the pages of Doctor Strange. So yeah, that's exactly what I talked about earlier when it comes to Man-Thing. That's where I got the Man-Thing inspiration on this episode from. Circling back though to Tobias Ford, disappearing, teleporting because he's caught between worlds. Now this has us think of a lot of comic book characters, some actually belonging more in the X-Men universe, and I'm not saying they can't reference them. I mean, after all, they are basically referencing the comics and not the X-Men universe, but nonetheless, to stick with the one that we know did become part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I'm thinking Tyrone Johnson, aka Cloak from Cloak and Dagger. Now in the comics and supposedly on the series as well, Tyrone teleports great distances by hopping into the Dark Dimension, moving a short distance within said dimension, and porting back to Earth only he's traveled a greater distance. As a bonus here, and as we did see on the series, he does leave a momentary trail of smoke as he does vanish. Could it be possible that Cloak was the inspiration? Could it be possible that they were thinking, you know what, we're gonna do Cloak and Dagger one day on Marvel television? Well, in this universe and with these minds, Kevin Feige and Jeff Loeb behind these movies and these TV series, you can expect anything. But before I get back to Ghost Rider and then talk foreshadowing, there's still the stinger of this episode. And on set stinger, May is now the prankster, but that's not really the issue over here. The issue is, they're playing upwards, and that scene is just full of Easter eggs. On the board you've got espionage, and espionage is basically the core word missing in the S.H.I.E.L.D. definition from the comics within the MCU. The Aglet was one I had to research, but apparently there's an Aglet company in Marvel Comics, Acme Aglet Company. We've also got Strange Tales, the comic book on the pages of which S.H.I.E.L.D. debuted as an organization in the 60s, and the fact that we've got the word Tales makes me think as well of Tales of Suspense, the comic book that introduced Iron Man for the very first time into Marvel Comics, and also the comic book where he battled Professor Ford. But finally, there is Zodiac, the weapon from the Agent Carter one-shot, and from the comics as well. Now, before I talk foreshadowing and then end this video, I've got a little bit of a stretch over here. Yeah, definitely a stretch with me knowing how Season 4 unfolded. But you've got talk about Hell, which plants Ghost Rider in the back of your head. You've got the mention of the Nightmare Box, which plants thoughts of Man-Thing and Doctor Strange in the back of your head as well. Man-Thing gets possessed by demons in the comics, which once again makes you think of Ghost Rider. There's also the fact that Doctor Strange, the Dark Dimension and whatnot, makes you once again think of Ghost Rider. You finally got the particle accelerator explosion, which felt very similar to the experiment that in the comics gave Owen Reece his powers, making him into the Molecule Man. And finally, you've got Doctor Strange releasing around the same time as Season 4 and opening the door to the kind of world for Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. to parallel it all with the Ghost Rider. You've got the Eli Morrow version of Molecule Man on the series, and you've got Hell, even though Ghost Rider kind of defines it differently. So were they just giving us the usual reference and the usual Easter egg, or were they just telling us that they wanted to do this if they ever can? Anyway though, when it comes to foreshadowing on this episode, we've got Hannah, the presumed telekinetic, unable to control her powers. That's the assumption that the team makes at first. They also assume she fears her powers. That's exactly Daisy in the future, fearing her powers, unable to control them, or rather them dealing damage to her very own bones. Let's not forget as well that on an emotional level, and out of the entire team, Daisy was the one that connected with Hannah more than anyone else. But on this episode as well, the Cavalry name keeps coming up over and over again, and we hear different versions of the story about May and what she did in Bahrain. Now, even though we don't get the full version of the story, the closest version to what happened was the one relayed to Daisy by Coulson. But finally though, Daisy stating that if anyone could bring back the old May, it would be Coulson. That definitely foreshadowed the Melinda in the future of the series. But that being said though, my work here is done, so let me know in the comments if you're doing a rewatch of the series, and if you are, did you find any Easter eggs, references, or bits of foreshadowing that I did not notice rewatching these episodes? Let me know as well if you did like this video by dropping it one of those much appreciated likes, subscribing to this channel, and enabling notifications for my future videos, community posts, and live streams. Don't forget as well to check out my previous 3 videos in this Rediscovering S.H.I.E.L.D. series. But if you don't, until the next time you tune in for another one of my videos, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. or otherwise, thank you so much for tuning into this one, and have a great day.